The aroma of damp hay and livestock filled the air as Willow Foster stumbled toward the only shelter visible in the growing darkness. Lightning streaked across the Montana sky, illuminating her bedraggled figure for a brief moment before thunder crashed overhead, drowning out her exhausted sob. The abandoned homestead loomed before her, a weathered house with broken windows, a listing barn, and a small, intact goat pen with a partial roof that promised at least some protection from the torrential rain. It was 1878, and Willow had lost everything in the span of a single week. Her father, her home, her future all gone. Now she found herself in a race against the elements, with nothing but the sodden clothes on her back and a small bundle of possessions tied in a damp shawl. She pushed open the rickety gate of the goat pen, wincing as rusty hinges squealed in protest. Inside, the smell was stronger but not unbearable. No animals had been kept here for some time, though tufts of coarse hair still clung to the rough-hewn posts. The roof leaked in several places, but a corner remained dry enough. Willow sank down onto the dirt floor, pulled her knees to her chest, and finally allowed herself to weep. 2 days ago, she'd been safely tucked away in her father's general store in Cripple Creek, Colorado, helping customers and dreaming of the teaching position she'd been promised in Denver come fall. Then the letter had arrived, followed swiftly by the banker and his men. Her father, it seemed, had leveraged everything on a mining investment that had gone spectacularly wrong. He'd taken his own life rather than face the disgrace, leaving 22-year-old Willow alone to confront their creditors. "You have until sundown tomorrow," the banker had told her, not unkindly but firmly. "Take what you can carry. The rest goes to auction." She grabbed what little money remained, a few personal items, and boarded the first stagecoach heading north. No plan, just a desperate need to escape the whispers and pitying glances. Then the stagecoach had been robbed, her money taken, and she'd been abandoned at a remote way station with other passengers. She'd walked for miles before the storm hit, following what passed for a road in these parts. Now, as lightning flashed again, Willow glimpsed movement beyond the gate. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows. The silhouette of a horse and rider approached the homestead. She held her breath, praying whoever it was would take shelter in the main house and leave her undiscovered. The rider dismounted in a fluid motion that spoke of countless hours in the saddle. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. He led his horse toward the barn but paused, head tilting as though listening. Willow realized too late that her ragged breathing might have given her away. "Who's there?" The man's voice was deep, graveled by the elements, but not threatening. He reached for something at his hip, a gun, she presumed, and Willow panicked. "Please," she called out, her voice breaking. "I mean no harm. I just needed shelter from the storm." The man approached the goat pen cautiously, one hand still hovering near his holster. When lightning flashed again, Willow saw his face clearly for the first time, weathered and sun-browned, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and eyes that seemed to assess every detail of her situation in an instant. "Well now," he said, surprise evident in his tone as he took in her bedraggled appearance. "What in heaven's name is a woman doing out here alone?" "Surviving," Willow answered, summoning what dignity she could while huddled in straw and dirt. The man was silent for a long moment before he nodded, as if coming to some internal decision. "Name's Matthew Blackwood. This is my property you're trespassing on, madam." Willow's stomach dropped. "I apologize, Mr. Blackwood. I thought it was abandoned. I'll leave immediately. In this weather? That'd be foolish, and you don't strike me as a foolish woman." He gestured toward the main house. "There's a roof that doesn't leak and a fireplace that still draws. You're welcome to proper shelter, Mississippi. Foster. Willow Foster." She hesitated, clutching her small bundle tighter. "I don't want to impose." Matthew Blackwood's expression softened slightly. Miss Foster, that's no place for anyone, let alone someone like you.
Come on now.
My horse needs tending, and you look like you could use a warm fire and a hot meal. Willow considered her options, which were painfully few. Pride whispered that she should decline, but common sense prevailed. She rose on unsteady legs, brushing futilely at her mud-stained skirts before following Matthew toward the house. The structure was in better condition than it had appeared from a distance. Matthew explained as they approached that he'd purchased the property recently and was in the process of restoring it. He'd been in town for supplies when the storm hit and had raced back, concerned about his livestock in the barn. Inside, the house was spare but clean. A table and chairs occupied one corner of the main room, a stone fireplace dominated another, and a small bed was pushed against the far wall. Willow stood awkwardly by the door, painfully aware of her disheveled state and the impropriety of being alone with a strange man. "I need to see to my horse," Matthew said, seemingly reading her discomfort. "There's a kettle by the fire and provisions in that cupboard. Make yourself at home. I'll be back shortly." When he'd gone, Willow approached the fireplace where embers still glowed. She added kindling from a nearby basket, coaxing the fire back to life with practiced movements. The simple task calmed her, reminding her of evenings spent helping her father close up the store. The memory brought fresh tears, which she wiped away impatiently. Matthew returned some time later, bringing with him the scent of rain and horses. He'd removed his coat and hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to physical labor, filling the kettle with water from a bucket and hanging it over the fire. "Hope you don't mind coffee," he said, reaching for a tin on a shelf. "It's not fancy, but it's hot." "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." Willow remained standing, unsure of her place in this stranger's home. "Mr. Blackwood, I want to apologize again for trespassing. I truly believe the property was abandoned." He gestured for her to sit at the table. "Most folks around here think the same. The Johnsons who owned it before moved on after 3 bad harvests in a row. I got it for a song last fall, been fixing it up since." He paused, studying her with those assessing eyes. "What brings you to these parts, Miss Foster? Not many women travel alone through this territory." Willow considered fabricating a story, but found she lacked the energy for deception. "Necessity, Mr. Blackwood. My father recently passed, and circumstances forced me to leave Colorado rather suddenly." "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and the simple sincerity in his voice nearly undid her composure. "Thank you." She swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "I was headed north. I have a distant cousin in Helena who might take me in until I can secure employment." Matthew nodded, not pressing for details she wasn't offering. Instead, he busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and biscuits that he reheated on the fire. The food was plain but filling, and Willow realized she hadn't eaten since early morning. As they ate, Matthew spoke of his ranch, 20 acres with a small herd of cattle and hopes for expansion if the next few seasons proved profitable. He'd worked as a ranch hand since he was 16, saving every penny until he could afford his own spread. There was quiet pride in his voice when he described his plans, a certainty that Willow envied. "The stage won't come through again for 3 days," he said as they finished their meal. "You're welcome to stay until then. I'll sleep in the barn." Willow shook her head. "I couldn't possibly put you out of your home. It's no trouble. I've slept in worse places." He stood, gathering their plates. "There's water for washing up in that basin. I'll bring in your things from the goat pen." Before she could protest further, he was gone again, leaving Willow alone with her thoughts. The warmth of the fire and the fullness in her stomach made her realize just how exhausted she truly was. By the time Matthew returned with her bundle, she was fighting to keep her eyes open. "Get some rest," he said, heading for the door. "We'll figure things out in the morning." Willow wanted to thank him properly. to express the depth of her gratitude for his kindness to a stranger, but fatigue claimed her. She managed only a murmured good night before he closed the door behind him. She washed as best she could with the cold water in the basin, changed into her spare chemise, and slipped beneath the covers of Matthew's bed. The sheets smelled of sunshine and something distinctly masculine, not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. As rain continued to drum against the roof, Willow fell into the deepest sleep she'd had in days, secure in the knowledge that, at least for tonight, she was safe. Morning arrived with gentle persistence, sunlight streaming through windows that had been hastily repaired with oilskin in places where glass was missing. Willow woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly in her least dirty garments, grateful that her bundle had protected a change of clothes from the worst of the rain. Outside, she found Matthew already at work, mending a section of fence that had been damaged in the storm. He straightened as she approached, pushing back his hat to reveal eyes the color of weathered denim. "Morning, Miss Foster. Sleep well." "Better than I have in quite some time," she admitted. "Thank you again for your hospitality." He nodded, hammering another nail into place before responding. "There's coffee on the stove and oats for breakfast. Help yourself." Willow hesitated. "I'd like to earn my keep while I'm here, Mr. Blackwood. I'm not afraid of work." Something like approval flickered in his expression. "Fair enough. After breakfast, I could use help with the garden plot. Previous owners let it go to seed, but the soil's good." The next 3 days fell into an unexpectedly comfortable rhythm. Mornings were spent working side by side, Willow in the garden, clearing weeds and turning soil, while Matthew repaired storm damage and tended to his small herd of cattle. Afternoons brought different tasks: laundry for Willow, fence mending for Matthew. In the evenings, they shared simple meals and conversation that grew less guarded with each passing day. Willow learned that Matthew had lost his parents young and been raised by an uncle who taught him ranching. He'd fought briefly in the closing days of the war, though he spoke little of that time. He'd drifted west afterward, working cattle drives and saving money until he could afford his own place. In turn, she told him about growing up in her father's store, about her mother's death from influenza when Willow was 16, and her dreams of becoming a teacher. She even, on the second evening, confessed the true circumstances of her hasty departure from Colorado. "He couldn't face the shame," she said quietly, staring into the fire. "My father was a proud man. The idea of everyone knowing he'd failed, that he'd lost everything. It was too much for him." Matthew was silent for a long moment. "Sounds to me like he was thinking more of himself than of you." The blunt assessment startled Willow. "He was a good father." "I don't doubt it. But a man's responsibilities don't end when times get hard." Matthew's voice held no judgment, just a quiet certainty. "He left you to face those creditors alone." Willow had never considered it that way. Her grief for her father had been tangled with understanding for his desperation, never anger at his abandonment. She found herself unexpectedly tearful. "I'm sorry," Matthew said immediately. "That was poorly said." "No." Willow wiped at her eyes. "Perhaps it needed saying. I've been so focused on running away that I haven't really thought about being left behind." On the third day, as Willow was hanging laundry to dry in the bright Montana sunshine, she spotted a rider approaching from the east. Her stomach tightened with anxiety. Would this be someone looking for her? But Matthew, working nearby, showed no alarm. "Mail carrier," he explained, shading his eyes against the glare. "Comes through once a week, weather permitting. Brings news and any packages from town." The rider, a wiry man with a gray-streaked beard, hailed Matthew with familiar ease. They spoke for several minutes before Matthew approached Willow with a troubled expression. "Stage won't be coming through after all," he said. "Bridge washed out in the storm. They're rerouting north of here for at least 2 weeks until repairs are made." Willow's heart sank.
Oh,
I see. 2 more weeks until she could continue her journey to Helena, 2 more weeks of imposing on Matthew's hospitality. Perhaps there's another way I could travel? A wagon train or… Matthew shook his head. Not safely. This territory can be dangerous for travelers, especially women alone. He hesitated. You're welcome to stay until the stage resumes its route. There's plenty of work to do around here, and I won't deny the company's been pleasant. The way he said pleasant with a slight roughening of his voice caused an unexpected flutter in Willow's chest. She'd been so consumed with survival that she hadn't allowed herself to notice how Matthew's presence affected her. Now, standing in the sunlight with his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms tanned by outdoor work, she couldn't help but notice. If you're certain I wouldn't be imposing, she said carefully. I wouldn't offer if I didn't mean it. His direct gaze held hers. Truth is, Miss Foster, this place could use a woman's touch. And I could use the help. That evening, Matthew moved a small cot into the main room for himself, insisting that Willow continue to use the bed. The arrangement was far from proper, but their circumstances were unusual, and Willow found herself more concerned with Matthew's comfort than with conventional propriety. This can't be comfortable for you, she observed as he arranged a blanket on the narrow cot. Compared to some cattle drives I've been on, this is downright luxurious, he replied with a hint of a smile. Don't worry about me, Miss Foster. Willow, she said suddenly. Please call me Willow. After all we've shared these past days, Miss Foster seems unnecessarily formal. He nodded slowly. Willow, then. And I'm Matthew, not Mr. Blackwood. The simple exchange of first names felt strangely intimate in the firelit room. Willow retreated to the bed, hyper-aware of Matthew's presence just feet away as she tried to settle into sleep. The following days brought a deepening of their unusual domestic partnership. Willow took over the cooking, creating more varied meals from Matthew's modest supplies. She cleaned the house thoroughly, washing windows and sweeping away cobwebs from corners. The physical labor was therapeutic, giving her less time to dwell on her grief and uncertainty. Matthew, for his part, seemed to take greater care with his appearance, shaving more regularly and changing into clean shirts for dinner. He brought Willow wildflowers one evening, presenting them awkwardly with a gruff, thought these might brighten up the table. A week after Willow's arrival, they received visitors, a neighboring rancher named Thomas Wilson and his wife, Rebecca, who'd heard about Matthew's houseguest from the mail carrier and come to investigate under the guise of neighborly concern. Rebecca Wilson was a plump, pleasant woman with kind eyes that couldn't quite hide her curiosity as she took in the domestic scene at Matthew's ranch. We're so pleased Matthew has company, she said to Willow as they prepared coffee for the men, who were discussing cattle prices in the yard. He's kept to himself since moving in last fall. Hardly comes to town except for supplies. He's been very kind to me, Willow replied carefully, aware that appearances could easily lead to misunderstandings. She briefly explained her circumstances, emphasizing her plans to continue to Helena once the stage was running again. Rebecca nodded sympathetically. Terrible about your father, dear. But perhaps Providence had a hand in bringing you here. Her meaningful glance toward the window where Matthew could be seen gesturing emphatically to Thomas made her implication clear. It's not like that, Willow protested, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Matthew is simply being charitable to a traveler in need. Rebecca patted her hand with a knowing smile. Of course, dear. Though I've never known Matthew Blackwood to be particularly charitable before. Honest and hardworking, yes, but not one to open his home to strangers. The Wilsons' visit, though brief, shifted something between Willow and Matthew. That evening, as they sat before the fire, an awkward tension had replaced their comfortable companionship. Rebecca Wilson means well, Matthew said finally, breaking the silence. But she's a notorious matchmaker. Half the marriages in the county started with her meddling. Willow managed a small laugh. I gathered as much. She made certain to tell me you're considered quite a catch-a-man with his own land and no entanglements. Matthew winced. I apologize if she made you uncomfortable. She didn't, Willow assured him, though it wasn't entirely true. Rebecca's comments had forced her to confront feelings she'd been avoiding: awareness of Matthew as more than just her benefactor, attraction to his quiet strength and unexpected gentleness. But I fear we may have given the wrong impression about our arrangement. People will talk regardless of what we do or don't do, Matthew said with a philosophical shrug. Nature of small communities. I wouldn't want to damage your reputation. My reputation? He laughed, a warm sound that Willow had heard too rarely. Willow, I'm a 30-year-old bachelor rancher. The only reputation I have is for being unsociable and stubborn. If anything, your presence here has improved local opinion of me. His casual dismissal of propriety both relieved and unsettled Willow. In Colorado, such an arrangement would have been scandalous. Here, in the sparsely populated Montana territory, different standards seemed to apply. Besides, Matthew continued more seriously, you'll be gone soon enough, on to your cousin in Helena. The reminder of her planned departure sent an unexpected pang through Willow's chest. In just over a week, this isolated ranch had begun to feel like a sanctuary rather than a temporary shelter. And Matthew? Yes, she said, forcing brightness into her tone. Once the stage is running again. The second week of Willow's stay brought changes to the weather and to their evolving relationship. Spring was advancing rapidly across the Montana landscape, bringing warmer days and explosive growth to the garden Willow had reclaimed from wilderness. She took pride in the neat rows of vegetables beginning to sprout, in the wildflowers she'd transplanted near the house, in the increasingly home-like atmosphere of Matthew's previously Spartan dwelling. Matthew, too, seemed to be flourishing under her presence. He smiled more readily, laughed more often, and had begun to share stories from his past that revealed a dry wit and thoughtful nature she found increasingly appealing. One evening, as they walked the property after dinner, a habit they'd developed in recent days, Matthew pointed to a ridge in the distance. My land extends to that line of cottonwoods, he said. Beyond that is Wilson property, and beyond that, government land that'll likely be parceled out to homesteaders eventually. Willow tried to imagine the empty landscape, filled with farms and families. It's beautiful country. It can be harsh, too, Matthew cautioned. Winters are brutal. Summers bring drought some years. It takes a certain kind of person to love this land through all its moods. Someone stubborn, Willow suggested with a small smile. Stubborn, yes, but also hopeful. He glanced at her, then quickly away. Someone who can see possibilities where others might see only challenges. They walked in companionable silence until reaching a small stream that cut across the property. The setting sun painted the water gold and copper, a display so breathtaking that Willow gasped softly. This is my favorite spot, Matthew admitted. When I first saw this land, it was winter. Everything was frozen and gray. But this stream still flowed beneath the ice. I knew then that if water could find its way through frozen ground, I could make something of this place. The simple poetry of his words moved Willow deeply. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the rugged rancher who had taken her in, but a man of profound feeling and determination. You have made something of it, she said quietly. Something wonderful. Matthew turned to her, his expression unguarded in the fading light. It's been different these past days with you here. Better. The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken feelings. Then, with gentle deliberation, Matthew reached for her hand. His palm was calloused against hers, warm and solid. Willow didn't pull away. I know you're planning to leave, he said, his voice rougher than usual. And I have no right to ask you to change those plans. But I find myself wishing circumstances were different. Willow's heart hammered in her chest. Different how? Different in that we might have met in the normal way of things. Different in that you might have chosen to come here, rather than being forced by necessity. His grip tightened slightly. Different in that I might have properly courted you, instead of offering shelter to a woman with few options. The honesty of his declaration took Willow's breath away. There had been suitors in Cripple Creek, the banker's son, a young lawyer, but none had affected her as Matthew did, with his straightforward integrity and unexpected tenderness. "I don't feel forced to be here," she said carefully. "Not anymore." Hope flared in Matthew's eyes, quickly tempered by caution. "What are you saying, Willow?" "I'm saying that perhaps we should consider all possibilities before I make decisions about leaving." She squeezed his hand. "I'm saying that these days with you have been healing. That I've come to care for this place, and for you." Matthew's smile transformed his face, erasing years of solitude in an instant. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning rather than demanding, and Willow responded with a tentative sweetness that gradually deepened into something more certain. When they finally parted, the first stars had appeared in the darkening sky. Matthew rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "I never expected this," he murmured. "Never thought I'd find someone who could understand this life, who might want to share it." "I don't know if I can," Willow admitted honestly. "I've never lived on a ranch. I was raised in town, with different expectations. But I'd like to try, if you're willing to be patient with me." "Patience I have in abundance," Matthew assured her with another quick kiss. "Had to survive out here alone." They walked back to the house hand in hand, both aware that a significant boundary had been crossed. That night, though their sleeping arrangements remained unchanged, the atmosphere in the small house was charged with new awareness and possibility. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Willow was gathering eggs from the small chicken coop Matthew maintained when she heard horses approaching. 2 riders, both men, were making their way up the path to the house. Something about their purposeful approach sent a chill through her. She hurried toward the barn where Matthew was repairing a saddle. "Matthew," she called urgently, "there are men coming." He straightened immediately, hand dropping instinctively to the pistol he wore even while working. "Stay here," he instructed, moving to intercept the visitors. Willow retreated into the barn doorway, but remained where she could observe the encounter. The men dismounted, and one stepped forward with an air of authority. Even from a distance, Willow could see the badge pinned to his vest. A lawman. Cold dread washed through her. Had someone from Colorado tracked her down? Were there legal consequences for her father's financial disaster that had followed her north? Unable to contain her anxiety, Willow moved toward the group, arriving in time to hear the marshal introduce himself. "Looking for a woman who may have passed through these parts," he was saying. "Name of Willow Foster." Stage driver mentioned dropping a passenger fitting her description near here before the storm. Matthew's posture was relaxed but alert. "Any particular reason you're looking for this woman, Marshal?" The lawman glanced at Willow as she approached, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You must be Miss Foster," he said, tipping his hat. "I've got a telegram for you from Colorado. Been trying to deliver it for days." Relief made Willow's knees weak. "Not pursuit then, just a message." "Yes, I'm Willow Foster." The marshal reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "Came through to the office in town. Addressed urgent, so I thought I'd deliver it personally, since I was riding this way." Willow accepted the telegram with trembling fingers. Breaking the seal, she read the brief message. "Miss Foster, stop error discovered in account, stop father's investment, recovered, stop funds held in your name at First Bank of Denver, stop please contact immediately, TO claim inheritance, stop J. Harrison attorney." She read it twice, unable to comprehend the reversal of fortune. Matthew stepped closer, concern evident in his expression. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. Wordlessly, Willow handed him the telegram. As he read, his face remained impassive, but something in his eyes shuddered. "Well," he said finally, returning the paper to her. "Seems your circumstances have changed considerably." The marshal, oblivious to the tension suddenly stretching between them, nodded in satisfaction. "Glad to have delivered it. I'll be heading back to town now. Stage should be running again by next week if you're looking to head south." After the lawman departed, Willow and Matthew stood in awkward silence, the telegram like a physical barrier between them. "This changes things," Matthew said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Does it have to?" Willow countered, reaching for his hand. He didn't pull away, but neither did he return her grip with the warmth of the previous evening. "You have options now. Real options, not just making the best of a difficult situation." "Matthew, the money doesn't change how I feel about, doesn't it?" His interruption was gentle but firm. "Yesterday, you were a woman with few prospects, grateful for shelter. Today, you're an heiress who could go anywhere, do anything." "That's not fair," Willow protested. "I wasn't with you out of gratitude or desperation." Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe not. But we can't know for certain, can we? Everything happens so fast and under unusual circumstances. I think we both need time to consider what this means." The rational part of Willow knew he was right. They had known each other barely 2 weeks, in a situation where normal courtship rules didn't apply. But her heart rebelled against his sudden withdrawal. "So, last night meant nothing?" she asked, hating the quaver in her voice. "It meant everything," Matthew said with quiet intensity. "Which is why I won't have you making decisions based on temporary emotions or misplaced gratitude. If what's between us is real, it will withstand the test of practical considerations." Practical considerations. The phrase struck Willow as absurdly inadequate to describe the tumult of feelings she was experiencing. Yet she recognized the wisdom in Matthew's caution. Her life had been upended twice in as many weeks, first by disaster, then by unexpected reprieve. She needed time to adjust to these new circumstances before making life-altering decisions. "What would you have me do?" she asked finally. "Go to Denver," Matthew said, and it clearly cost him to say it. "Claim your inheritance, settle your affairs. Take the time to consider what you truly want, without the pressure of immediate need. And if what I want is to return here, to you." Something like hope flickered in his eyes. "Then I'll be waiting. But I need to know you've chosen freely, Willow, that you've considered all your options and still want this life, which is not an easy one, even with financial security." The days that followed were strained with unspoken feelings and careful distance. Matthew threw himself into ranch work, often leaving before dawn and returning after dark, exhausted beyond conversation. Willow continued her domestic duties and tending the garden, but the joy had dimmed from these tasks. The mail carrier brought news that the stage would resume its normal route the following Tuesday. Willow made preparations for departure, packing her meager belongings and writing a letter to the attorney in Denver announcing her imminent arrival. On her last evening at the ranch, Matthew returned earlier than usual. He'd bathed and changed into clean clothes and carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I wanted to give you this," he said, handing it to Willow. "A remembrance." Inside the package was a journal bound in soft leather, its pages blank and promising. "I noticed you writing sometimes, on scraps of paper," Matthew explained. "Thought you might like something proper to keep your thoughts in." The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to Willow's eyes. "Thank you. I'll treasure it." "I'm not much for writing myself," Matthew continued awkwardly. "But I'd welcome letters, if you were of a mind to send them." "Of course I'll write," Willow promised. "And you'll reply?" He nodded. "Though I can't promise my penmanship will be anything to admire." They stood in uncomfortable silence until Matthew cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what to say to you tonight. Practiced it even while I was mending fences. But now that the moment's here, I find I don't have the words after all. Then don't use words, Willow suggested softly. Matthew needed no further invitation. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, gathering her into an embrace that spoke more eloquently than any rehearsed speech. His kiss was different from their first, deeper, more urgent, tinged with the bittersweet knowledge of impending separation. When they finally parted, both breathless, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I'm not asking for promises," he said roughly. "Just that you'll think of me sometimes, and remember these days kindly." "I'll do more than think of you," Willow replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll come back, Matthew. Once my affairs are settled, I'll return." He smiled, though his eyes remained serious. "I hope you will. But if life takes you in another direction, know that I'll understand. I want your happiness, Willow, even if it's not with me." That night, they sat before the fire talking until the embers died, sharing stories and hopes and pieces of themselves they'd held back before. It was as if the certainty of their parting had freed them to be fully honest, to reveal vulnerabilities they might otherwise have hidden. Morning came too quickly. Matthew hitched his wagon to drive Willow to the stage depot, loading her trunk now containing new clothes Rebecca Wilson had insisted on providing and supplies for her journey that Matthew had purchased in town. The ride to the depot was quiet, both lost in thoughts of what might have been and what might still be. When they arrived, the stage was already waiting, other passengers boarding with their luggage. Matthew helped Willow down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. "Right when you reach Denver," he said. "Just so I know you've arrived safely." "I will." She reached up to touch his face, memorizing the feel of him. "This isn't goodbye, Matthew. It's just until we meet again." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Until then," he agreed. The stagecoach journey south was long and uncomfortable, giving Willow ample time to second-guess her decision to leave. By the time she reached Denver, however, practical matters demanded her full attention. The attorney, J. Harrison, proved to be a fussy, meticulous man who required multiple meetings to explain the situation with her father's investments. "Quite remarkable, really," he told her during their first meeting. "Your father invested in a mine that everyone believed had played out. The initial reports were discouraging, which led to his unfortunate actions. But just weeks later, a new vein was discovered, quite rich, in fact. Your father's share of the venture is now worth considerably more than his original investment." The irony of it struck Willow with painful force. Had her father waited just a little longer, he might still be alive. They might still be in Cripple Creek, continuing their quiet life together. She would never have met Matthew. That thought brought her up short. Despite the tragedy that had led her to Montana, she couldn't regret meeting Matthew Blackwood. In their brief time together, he had shown her possibilities she hadn't known existed not just for romance, but for a different kind of life altogether. One with greater challenges, perhaps, but also deeper satisfactions. Over the next weeks, Willow settled her father's affairs and claimed her inheritance. The sum was substantial enough to provide security for years to come, or to establish a new business, or even to improve a struggling ranch in Montana Territory. The thought came to her with increasing frequency as she navigated Denver society. She had been welcomed into the homes of her father's former business associates, introduced to eligible men who made no secret of their interest in a young woman of means. She had even been offered the teaching position she'd once coveted. Yet none of these opportunities filled her with the sense of purpose she'd felt helping Matthew reclaim his garden from wilderness, or the quiet joy of sharing simple meals at his table, or the exhilaration of watching the sun set over his land. 6 weeks after arriving in Denver, Willow sat down with her leather journal now filled with thoughts and observations and wrote a letter unlike any of the careful, newsy missives she'd been sending north. "Dear Matthew, I have come to a decision. Denver holds many opportunities, but none that call to my heart as strongly as the memory of your ranch, your stream, your quiet strength. If your offer still stands, I would like to return not as a woman seeking shelter, but as one who has considered all her options and chosen freely. I have means now to contribute to our future together, should you wish it. But more importantly, I have clarity about what I truly want. I want the challenge of ranch life, the beauty of Montana seasons, and the privilege of building something lasting with you. I will take the northbound stage on the 15th, arriving at the depot on or about the 22nd. If you are there to meet me, I will know your feelings remain unchanged. If not, I will understand and wish you well, grateful for the kindness you showed a desperate woman who slept in your goat pen. With deepest affection, Willow. The letter dispatched, Willow began preparations for departure. Her Denver acquaintances expressed bewilderment at her decision to return to the wilderness, but she smiled and packed regardless. The teaching position was declined with regret, her father's remaining business interests delegated to capable managers, and her trunk filled with practical items for ranch life alongside a few carefully chosen luxuries. As the stage rattled north through Wyoming territory, Willow alternated between nervous anticipation and quiet confidence. Matthew's letters had remained warm, if somewhat reserved, throughout their separation. He'd written of ranch developments, of a new breeding pair of horses he'd acquired, of plans for expanding the house someday. Never had he explicitly withdrawn his feelings or suggested she should stay in Denver. Yet neither had he pressed her to return or declared continued affection. The stage arrived at the depot on the afternoon of the 23rd, a day later than expected due to a broken wheel. Willow descended with stiff limbs and anxious heart, scanning the small gathering of waiting people for Matthew's tall figure. He wasn't there. Disappointment washed through her, followed quickly by practical concerns. How would she reach the ranch? Should she hire transportation, or find lodging in the small settlement and send word of her arrival? She was considering her options when a wagon came barreling down the road at dangerous speed, the driver pushing the team harder than was wise. As it drew closer, Willow recognized Matthew's broad shoulders and determined expression. The wagon skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust. Matthew leaped down, not bothering to secure the reins, and strode toward her with single-minded purpose. "You're late," he said accusingly, coming to a stop just feet away. "I've been here every day since the 20th waiting." Relief made Willow lightheaded. The wheel broke near Laramie. "We were delayed." "I thought." He swallowed hard. "I thought perhaps you'd changed your mind." "Never," Willow assured him. "I meant every word in my letter." The tension drained from Matthew's posture. "Thank God," he murmured, and then he was closing the distance between them, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that drew startled looks from onlookers. Willow found she didn't care about propriety or appearances, not when Matthew was holding her as if he'd never let go again. "I love you," he said against her hair. "Should have told you before you left. Been regretting it every day since." Willow pulled back just enough to see his face. "I love you too. Enough to leave Denver and all its comforts for your leaky roof and stubborn cattle." He laughed, a joyous sound that turned heads. "The roof doesn't leak anymore. Fixed it last month. And I think you'll find other improvements as well." During the wagon ride to the ranch, Matthew explained that he'd spent the weeks of her absence preparing for her potential return. The house had been expanded with a proper bedroom and larger kitchen. The garden she'd started had been carefully tended. He'd even acquired a milk cow and more chickens, anticipating her preferences. "I didn't know if you'd come back," he admitted as they approached the property. "But I needed to be ready if you did." Willow's heart swelled at the evidence of his hope, his preparation, his commitment to making a place for her. When the ranch came into view, she gasped in delight. Wildflowers lined the approach. The house sported fresh paint and new curtains visible through clean windows, and a small porch had been added with 2 rocking chairs placed side by side. "Rebecca helped with the curtains," Matthew said, watching her reaction closely. and Thomas brought his sons to help with the addition. Seems everyone was invested in making the place welcoming enough to convince you to stay. It's not the improvements that convince me, Willow said softly. Though they're lovely, it's the man who made them. Matthew helped her down from the wagon with gentle hands. Welcome home, Willow. The word resonated through her with perfect rightness. Home. Not the place she'd fled from or the city she'd briefly inhabited, but this wild, beautiful ranch with its challenges and rewards and the man who stood before her, offering a life of shared purpose. I brought something for you, she said, reaching into her reticule. A token of my commitment. She pressed a small object into his palm, a gold nugget fashioned into a simple ring. It's from my father's mine, she explained. I had it made in Denver. If you want it, that is. If you're asking what I think you're asking. Matthew closed his fingers around the ring, his expression solemn. I'm asking for everything, Willow. For your hand, your heart, your future. For the right to build a life with you on this land. Then my answer is yes, she said simply. To everything. He slipped the ring onto his finger, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a silver band set with a small but perfect sapphire. Great minds think alike, he said with a smile that transformed his weathered face. Had this made in town last month. Been carrying it ever since, hoping for this moment. The ring fit perfectly on Willow's finger, catching the late afternoon sunlight as Matthew led her toward the house, their house now, in truth as well as promise. That evening, as they sat on the new porch, watching twilight settle over the land, Matthew recounted the story of their meeting to make Willow laugh. Never thought I'd find my future wife huddled in a goat pen, he teased. Imagine if I'd gone to the main house first instead of checking the livestock. Providence, Willow suggested, echoing Rebecca Wilson's assessment. Or just very good luck. Both, I think. Matthew's arm tightened around her shoulders. Though I knew that first night, watching you sleep by my fire, that you were someone special. That's when I told myself, Matthew, that goat pen was no place for someone like her. And now? Willow asked, leaning into his solid warmth. Now I think you're exactly where you belong. He kissed her temple. And so am I. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony attended by neighboring ranchers and their families. Rebecca Wilson wept openly, taking full credit for the match despite evidence to the contrary. Thomas Wilson presented them with a fine-breeding pair of goats since that's where it all started, he explained with a wink. The years that followed brought challenges, as ranch life inevitably did. Drought seasons tested their resilience, harsh winters their preparation, and the birth of their first child, a daughter they named Hope, their endurance. Willow's inheritance allowed for improvements that made the ranch increasingly profitable, and Matthew's hard work transformed ambitious plans into reality. By the time their second child, a son they called Daniel, arrived 3 years later, the Blackwood Ranch had become known throughout the territory for its fine horses and hospitality. Willow had established a small school for neighboring children, fulfilling her teaching ambitions in an unexpected way. Matthew had been elected to the Territorial Council, his straightforward integrity earning respect even from political opponents. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting, Matthew surprised Willow by taking her to the stream where they had first acknowledged their feelings. A picnic had been arranged, and their children raced ahead, eager to explore while their parents followed at a more sedate pace. Happy? Matthew asked, his hand warm in hers. The years of outdoor work had weathered his face further, adding distinguished lines around his eyes and mouth, but his smile remained the same, slightly crooked, wholly sincere. Willow considered the question seriously, as was her habit. At 32, she was no longer the desperate young woman who had fled Colorado with nothing but grief and uncertainty. Life as a rancher's wife had hardened her hands and tanned her skin, but also strengthened her spirit and expanded her heart. Completely, she answered honestly. You were right about this life being challenging. But You were also right about it being worth the struggle. Matthew nodded in satisfaction. I think about that storm sometimes. How if it hadn't driven you to seek shelter, if you hadn't chosen my goat pen of all places, we might never have met. I prefer to think we would have found each other somehow, Willow replied. That some things are simply meant to be. Ahead of them, Hope shrieked with delight as she discovered a family of ducklings paddling in the stream. Daniel, always more cautious, watched from a safe distance, clutching the hand of Rebecca Wilson's granddaughter, who had become his constant companion. Look at what we've built, Matthew said softly, his gaze taking in not just their children but the thriving ranch beyond, the community they'd helped establish, the life they'd created together. All because you were brave enough to leave that goat pen and accept my help. All because you were kind enough to offer it, Willow corrected, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. And wise enough to send me away so I could choose to come back. As they joined their children by the stream, Willow reflected that life rarely followed expected paths. The journey from desperate shelter seeker to confident ranch mistress had been filled with unexpected turns and challenges. Yet each step, even the painful ones, had led her here to this man, these children, this land that had become more home than any place she'd known before. The goat pen still stood on their property, maintained now as a practical structure rather than the desperate shelter it had once been. Sometimes, passing it while about her daily tasks, Willow would pause and remember the frightened young woman who had huddled there in the rain, unaware that she stood at the threshold of a new life. She would offer a silent prayer of gratitude for storms weathered and shelter found, for second chances and chosen paths, for the cowboy who had looked at a bedraggled stranger and seen not an object of pity, but a woman worthy of respect, honesty, and eventually, enduring love.